In the American Old West, legends were rarely simple, and few figures embody that contradiction better than Clay Allison. To some, he was a polite, soft-spoken Southerner who valued manners, loyalty, and personal honor. To others, he was an unpredictable force of chaos whose reputation inspired fear long before he ever entered a room. Clay Allison lived at the uneasy crossroads of civility and savagery, earning the unforgettable nickname, the Good-Natured Holy Terror. In this video, we peel back the myth to explore the real Clay Allison, his background, his temperament, and why his name still echoes through Old West history. Was he a misunderstood product of his time, or a genuine menace hidden behind a gentleman's smile? The truth, as always in the frontier, lies somewhere in between. What do you think? Was Clay Allison more gentleman than terror, or the other way around? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read everyone and love seeing different perspectives on Old West legends. If you enjoy deep dives into the real history behind frontier myths, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. More true stories, strange characters, and untold facts from the American Old West are coming your way. How much disruption Clay Allison actually caused during his time in Texas remains open to debate. What is clearer is that while living in Colfax County in New Mexico Territory, Allison generally involved himself in disputes tied to specific loyalties rather than random misconduct. Old West historian Paul Kuhl has pointed out that the description, good-natured holy terror, applies to several well-known frontier figures. Among those often mentioned are Curly Bill Brocious and Doc Holliday. One individual who arguably fits that label most closely is Robert Clay Allison himself, who reportedly preferred to think of his role as that of a shootist rather than a stereotypical gunman. From 1956, when Franciscan friar Stanley Francis Louis Crocchiola published the first biography of Allison, through the early 2000s, Clay Allison was frequently depicted as an unstable former Confederate who lashed out at ex-Union soldiers and anyone who challenged him. That portrayal, shaped by limited source material and early assumptions, became deeply ingrained and still influences popular opinion today. Unfortunately, much of the earliest research was incomplete or speculative, and later writers often repeated those conclusions without re-examining the evidence. When the myths are set aside, a more grounded picture emerges. During his early years in Texas, Allison appears to have been a young man shaped by 4 years of military service and considered reliable enough to be entrusted with major responsibility. Two respected Texas cattlemen selected him to serve as trail foreman on a drive spanning roughly 700 miles, an appointment that strongly suggests competence and trustworthiness. Until his arrival in New Mexico Territory, stories of Allison as a reckless troublemaker lack firm documentation and appear largely exaggerated. After reaching New Mexico Territory, Allison attempted to establish himself as a rancher, but soon became entangled in the Colfax County War, a conflict driven more by land, power, and legal uncertainty than by personal temperament. Not long afterward, he encountered serious legal difficulties in Colorado, prompting a temporary departure from the region. Once those issues were resolved, Allison returned to Texas, where records indicate he settled into a quieter life, becoming a family man and a generally respected member of his community. Allison's journey fits within a broader historical pattern. At the conclusion of the Civil War, tens of thousands of Southern men moved westward in search of opportunity, stability, and emotional recovery after years of upheaval. Clay Allison, born in Wayne County, Tennessee on September 2, 1840, though some sources list 1841, was among them. He served 2 enlistments in the Confederate Army and arrived in Palo Pinto County, Texas, in late 1865 or early 1866. By approximately 1867 to 68, Allison was serving as foreman on a cattle drive from Stephenville in Erath County, Texas, to Colfax County, New Mexico Territory. The herd was jointly assembled by Irwin W. Lacey and Lewis G. Coleman for practical and safety reasons. Upon arrival, the cattle were divided between the 2 owners, who settled along the Vermejo River, Coleman to the north and Lacey to the south. As compensation for his work, Allison received 300 head of cattle, equivalent to 1 out of every 10 animals in the combined herd. He moved them onto a small tract of land along Paño Creek, a tributary of the Vermelho River. What none of the men realized at the time was that they were occupying land belonging to the massive Maxwell Land Grant, a 1.7 million acre property whose disputed ownership would later fuel significant legal and political conflict throughout the region. Before Clay Allison reached New Mexico territory, his image as a reckless frontier agitator existed largely in legend rather than in documented fact. Many of the stories attached to his name appear to have grown over time and were later reused by writers as colorful narrative devices rather than verifiable history. Popular anecdotes, such as his alleged unclothed horseback ride through Canadian Texas or a dramatic encounter involving a knife in a grave, lack contemporary evidence and are best understood as folklore rather than reliable accounts. By contrast, Allison's activities in New Mexico territory are supported by more substantial documentation. One of the clearest explanations of the environment he entered comes from an August 9, 1878, deposition recorded by federal investigator Frank Warner Angel. In that statement, Colfax County Attorney Frank Springer described ongoing unrest in the county that stemmed from disputes between the Maxwell Land Grant Company, railroad interests, and local settlers over land ownership and legal possession. Following the 1869-70 sale of a vast tract of land by Lush and Bonaparte Maxwell, the English-controlled Maxwell Land Grant Company sought to remove ranchers and families who had settled on the property. Many of those residents were Mexican families whose presence on the land dated back decades to the original 1841 Mexican land grant awarded to the Beaubien and Miranda families. As legal pressure increased, settlers became more determined to remain, and tensions escalated as both sides hardened their positions. While cattlemen Irwin W. Lacey and Lewis G. Coleman largely avoided direct involvement, Allison became entangled in what later came to be known as the Colfax County War. This episode reflected the broader instability of late 19th century New Mexico, which at the time was still a federal territory governed by presidential appointment rather than local election. Between 1875 and 1878, the territorial governor was Samuel Beach Axtell, who was closely aligned with a powerful political network commonly referred to as the Santa Fe Ring. This group exercised significant influence over land policy, courts, and economic development throughout the territory. Prominent members included U.S. District Attorney Stephen B. Elkins, Territorial Attorney General Thomas B. Catron, and Judge Joseph G. Palin, whose judicial district included Cimarron, the Colfax County seat. Local representatives of the ring in Colfax County included Dr. Robert H. Longwell and attorney Melvin W. Mills. South of the county in Las Vegas, New Mexico, influence rested with Benjamin Stevens, the district attorney for the 2nd Judicial District. Together, these figures formed a tightly connected power structure that shaped territorial politics and land control. For a period, Allison aligned himself with this network, assisting influential men who relied on pressure and legal leverage to defend or expand their interests. However, historian Calvin Horn notes in New Mexico's troubled years that the situation changed dramatically after the September 1875 death of Reverend F.J. Tolby. Many residents believed Tolby had been targeted for opposing the Santa Fe Ring's efforts to dominate both the Maxwell Land Grant Company and county affairs. According to Horn's analysis, Allison had functioned as a loosely affiliated supporter of the ring prior to that incident. Afterward, however, he shifted his allegiance and became actively involved in the organized resistance of Colfax County settlers against territorial power brokers. This reversal marked a defining moment in Allison's historical role, positioning him less as a reckless individual and more as a participant in a broader struggle over land, authority, and self-determination in territorial New Mexico. In October 1875, reports later published in the November 9th issue of the Weekly New Mexican described growing suspicions surrounding the death of Methodist minister Reverend F.J. Tolby. Friends and associates of Tolby, especially fellow preacher Oscar P. McMains, became convinced that Cruz Vega, a part-time postal courier who had been seen near the scene, was responsible. Their certainty was based more on circumstance and rumor than on formal legal findings. McMains soon took a leading role in an extra-legal effort to obtain answers. A masked group, reportedly including Clay Allison, seized Vega near Pineal Creek and applied intense pressure until he implicated Manuel Cardenas in Tolby's death. This episode appears to mark one of the earliest points at which Allison distanced himself from the Santa Fe ring and aligned with those opposing its influence in Colfax County. Contemporary observers and later historians note that Allison reacted strongly when he believed an injustice had occurred, particularly when religious or moral principles were involved. Raised in the Bible Belt, he appears to have viewed the death of a Methodist minister as a matter demanding decisive action. This mindset helps explain his willingness to involve himself in confrontations tied to Tolby's killing. Tensions escalated further when Francisco Pancho Griego, a relative of Vega and an associate of the Santa Fe ring, publicly blamed Allison for Vega's fate and made it known around Cimarron that he intended to confront him. On November 1, 1875, the two men encountered one another at Lambert's Saloon inside the St. James Hotel. According to the Daily New Mexican of November 5th, the meeting began calmly, with both men sharing a drink and speaking briefly before the situation abruptly deteriorated. Newspaper accounts state that Griego attempted to distract Allison during their exchange, but the effort failed. Shots were fired and Griego died at the scene. While period reporting described Griego as a man with a fearsome reputation, such characterizations reflected the era's tendency to justify frontier outcomes rather than provide neutral analysis. Griego was buried in Cimarron and later reinterred in Santa Fe in 1877, where his family resided. 10 days later, on November 10, 1875, authorities arrested Manuel Cardenas and placed him in custody in Cimarron. Before formal legal proceedings could unfold, McMains and several supporters forcibly removed Cardenas from jail and compelled a confession. Cardenas claimed that he and Vega had participated in Tolby's death, and that others, including Griego, Florencio Donahue of Santa Fe, and local figures Melvin W. Mills and Dr. Robert H. Longwell, had financed the act. Although Cardenas was briefly released, officials soon rearrested him based on his confession. That same evening, another mob removed him from custody, and he did not survive the encounter. Later accounts allege that Allison may have been present either during the coercion of Cardenas or among those involved afterward, though no formal charges were brought against him. Notably, contemporary newspapers recorded little public outrage over Cardenas's fate. Reports emphasized his prior criminal record, including earlier convictions and public punishment in Taos, reflecting how frontier communities often weighed reputation heavily when judging events. From a historical standpoint, this episode illustrates the breakdown of legal authority in territorial New Mexico and highlights how rumor, politics, and personal loyalties frequently replace due process during periods of intense unrest. Following the death of Manuel Cardenas, Dr. Robert H. Longwell and attorney Melvin W. Mills assumed that Clay Allison had been involved with the vigilante group responsible. Both men compounded their fears by publicly suggesting that Allison himself should be eliminated from the situation. At the same time, they understood Allison's reputation for persistence and believed he might confront them before they could act against him. Concerned for their safety, Longwell and Mills left Cimarron and traveled to Fort Union. With assistance reportedly provided by military officers stationed there, they eventually made their way to Santa Fe. Their departure underscores how unstable Colfax County had become, even for prominent professionals aligned with territorial power structures. Early in January 1876, Allison found himself at odds with William D. Dawson, editor of the Cimarron News and Press. Allison objected to articles he believed favored the Santa Fe ring. On January 21st, according to one contemporary account, Allison and several associates forcibly entered the newspaper office, disabled the printing press, and disposed of type cases and equipment in the Cimarron River. This incident effectively ended Dawson's tenure as editor and marked a decisive shift in control of the paper. On January 28th, editorial leadership passed to William R. Morley and Frank W. Springer. After securing replacement equipment, the new editors published a 4-page edition, as later described by historian David L. Caffey. Under the headline, "Richard is Himself Again," the paper announced a new editorial direction, declaring its intention to serve as a voice for local citizens and to challenge what it described as corrupt territorial governance and legislative abuses. Morley and Springer soon became outspoken critics of the Santa Fe Ring. They also opposed Governor Samuel Beach Axtell's recent decision to relocate Colfax County's judicial proceedings to Taos County. This change required residents to travel roughly 60 miles across a difficult mountain route to attend court and raised widespread concern that jury selection in Taos could be manipulated by ring-aligned officials. By this point, Allison, who openly portrayed himself as an opponent of the Santa Fe Ring and its local allies, had become a persistent problem for territorial political leaders. His visibility and popularity among certain segments of the population made him difficult to marginalize or ignore. Springer later addressed how ring-affiliated officials attempted to manage the situation during an August 1878 deposition with Frank Warner Angel, a special investigator sent by the Department of the Interior to examine Governor Axtell's conduct. When asked whether the governor took any action regarding Colfax County after its judicial attachment to Taos County, Springer explained that he had returned to Cimarron, met with local citizens, and helped draft a formal invitation requesting the governor visit the county. Although the letter, signed by approximately a dozen residents, was received, Springer noted that the governor never provided a direct response. In early March 1876, while in Albuquerque, Frank W. Springer encountered Benjamin Stevens, a Santa Fe Ring affiliate from Las Vegas who served as district attorney for the 2nd Judicial District. Stevens told Springer that he intended to travel to Cimarron and might even remain there for a time, despite the town lying outside his judicial jurisdiction. He also claimed that he would attempt to persuade Governor Samuel Beach Axtell to visit Colfax County. Rather than proceeding directly to Santa Fe, Stevens traveled to Fort Union and soon returned to Cimarron, accompanied by approximately 30 soldiers from L Company of the 9th Cavalry, commanded by Captain Francis Moore. Upon his return, Stevens presented townspeople with a telegram he said came from Governor Axtell. The message instructed that it not be publicly known that the governor would arrive in Cimarron on the Saturday stagecoach. Stevens asserted that the telegram proved his efforts with the governor had succeeded and that Axtell planned to visit Colfax County. According to Springer's later testimony, Stevens stated that the governor expected to meet those who had signed the earlier invitation requesting his visit. He specifically mentioned Clay Allison as someone who should be present and urged newspaperman William R. Morley to keep the matter confidential, claiming the governor wished to avoid public attention. In reality, Governor Axtell never arrived in Cimarron on the announced date and had no intention of doing so. Springer later testified that the telegram and Stevens' actions were part of a broader scheme, the details of which were later revealed in a private letter Axtell wrote to Stevens. This correspondence, which likely came into Springer's possession in early April 1878, exposed the depth of coordination among territorial officials and the extraordinary measures they were prepared to consider in order to reassert control in Colfax County. The letter, commonly referred to as Axtell's Dear Ben letter, demonstrated the reach of the Santa Fe Ring within New Mexico's political and military structures and highlighted Stevens' role as an intermediary. Although Stevens later appears to have withdrawn from the most extreme aspects of the plan outlined in the letter, historians generally agree that he played a central role in setting events in motion. In the letter, Axtell suggested that Stevens' intentions were not widely suspected and expressed concern that military authorities believed Stevens had lost resolve. The governor urged Stevens to position his forces to detain the targeted individual and authorize forceful measures against anyone who resisted or supported opposition. He specifically referenced individuals who had signed the invitation requesting the governor's visit, including Porter, Morley, and Springer, and encouraged Stevens not to hesitate, warning that failure would carry serious personal and political consequences. From a historical perspective, this episode illustrates the extraordinary breakdown of civil governance in territorial New Mexico. Rather than relying on courts or transparent legal processes, powerful officials resorted to secrecy, intimidation, and coordinated misuse of authority. The survival of Axtell's letter provides rare documentary insight into how the Santa Fe ring operated and why resistance figures like Clay Allison and Frank Springer were viewed as threats by territorial leadership. Sensing that Governor Samuel Beach Axtell's intentions were suspect, the leading men of Cimarron deliberately avoided the arrival of the scheduled Saturday stagecoach. As a result, neither the invited citizens nor the governor himself appeared in town. With the plan to confront, or potentially eliminate, Colfax County's prominent figures effectively thwarted, troops from Fort Union remained stationed in Cimarron for several weeks afterward. Near the end of their first week in town, a detachment of soldiers rode into the surrounding countryside, encircled the home of Clay Allison, and placed him under arrest. Contrary to later legend, Allison offered no resistance and was escorted calmly back to Cimarron. After several hours in custody, he was released without charges and resumed his normal affairs. The scale of the arrest detail, which reportedly included a sheriff, commissioned officers, and roughly 45 U.S. cavalrymen, reflects both Allison's reputation and the degree of caution exercised by military and civil authorities. By December 1876, as the Colfax County War began to subside, at least in terms of Allison's involvement, he appeared ready to distance himself from the turmoil of northeastern New Mexico territory. He and his youngest brother, John William Allison, traveled north to Las Animas in Bent County, Colorado, intending to sell cattle and take advantage of the holiday season. While in Las Animas, the brothers became involved in an incident at a local dance hall that would have lasting consequences. On December 21st, after returning from the trail, Clay and John entered the Olympic Dance Hall to celebrate the approaching Christmas. Contemporary accounts describe their behavior as disruptive, drawing complaints from other patrons and prompting a response from local authorities. Bent County Deputy Sheriff Charles Faber arrived at the scene carrying a double-barreled shotgun and accompanied by two hastily appointed special deputies. What followed unfolded rapidly and chaotically. Gunfire broke out inside the hall, resulting in the death of Deputy Faber and a serious injury to John Allison. Later reports indicate that the confined space, confusion, and overlapping actions of those present contributed significantly to the tragic outcome. Hearing the disturbance, Sheriff John Spears arrived at the scene and placed both Allison brothers into custody. Although John William Allison had not discharged a weapon, a coroner's jury initially charged both men in connection with the death of Deputy Sheriff Charles Faber. Prosecutors later dismissed the charge against John, while Clay Allison faced a reduced allegation of manslaughter. Testimony from witnesses indicated that Deputy Faber had entered the crowded dance hall and fired without prior warning. As the case progressed, authorities were unable to locate reliable witnesses willing to testify against Allison. By the end of March 1877, the prosecution's case had weakened significantly, and Allison was released on a bond of $10,000, a substantial sum that reflected both the seriousness of the charge and his financial standing at the time. Earlier that month, possibly anticipating extended legal trouble, Allison sold his share of the family ranch along the Vermejo River in Colfax County to his brother John. In 1878, he left New Mexico Territory altogether. After a cattle-selling trip to St. Louis and a brief stay in Kansas, he settled at the junction of Gageby Creek and the Washita River in what was then Wheeler County, now Hemphill County, Texas. On October 31st, 1878, the Cimarron News and Press published a report describing Allison's involvement in a dramatic frontier incident near Fort Elliott. According to the newspaper, Allison and several ranchers were accompanying a military detachment as civilian volunteers when they encountered a settler's home under threat. After the commanding officer declined to advance, Allison reportedly organized a small group of volunteers who succeeded in reaching the family and escorting them to safety. While such newspaper accounts often emphasized heroism and should be read cautiously, the story reflects how Allison was portrayed publicly in Texas during this period. In 1883, Clay and Dora left the ranch at Gageby Creek and moved into a modest stone house near Pope's Wells, close to the Texas-New Mexico border. Allison routinely traveled to Pecos, approximately 40 miles to the south, to purchase supplies. It was during one of these trips that his life came to an unexpected end. On July 3, 1887, Allison died in what contemporary sources describe as a tragic accident. While crossing the Pecos River, his wagon struck a dense clump of vegetation, throwing him to the ground, where the wagon passed over his neck. Later that day, a cowboy discovered the unattended wagon and followed its tracks back to Allison's body. The unusual circumstances of his death have continued to puzzle Old West historians. By the time of his marriage, Allison had largely withdrawn from the conflicts that marked his years in New Mexico territory. He focused on ranching, abandoned heavy drinking, and devoted himself to family life. He was among the signers of a petition to establish Reeves County, Texas, and accounts from neighbors and acquaintances in the late 1880s describe him as a respected and dependable member of his community. As the dust finally settled on the life of Clay Allison, what remains is not a simple tale of chaos or heroism, but a deeply human story shaped by war, frontier justice, political corruption, and personal change. What's your take on Clay Allison? Was he a misunderstood product of his time, or did he truly earn his fearsome reputation? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. If you enjoy deep, fact-based stories that separate Old West myth from history, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. More untold stories, forgotten figures, and surprising truths from the American Old West are on the way.